over to you, Dave, and thanks again for joining us.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you everyone for turning out this evening to engage with my humble thoughts around these subjects. As Nick said, there are some copies of the book here, and Pat can do contact us just to get that cleared up and out of the way, should you wish to, flash your card around. And it's good to know that there won't be any heckling tonight because you've all been told to be quiet. But you can do all the heckling a little later. I can't recall when I first heard of something called the soul. Probably in my mother's womb, I would guess. It's been buried in my conscious and subconscious mind from pretty much the day I was born, I think. That was the kind of family that I grew up in. I grew up thinking that the soul was the immortal bit of me that would spend eternity either in everlasting bliss in heaven or in eternal conscious torment. Got to get the conscious in hell. No wonder I sometimes lay awake at night as a little boy, frightened out of my wits, scared crapless that I'd end up in the wrong place. I remember sneaking into my parents' bedroom in the dead of night to check if they were still there, afraid Jesus might have returned and taken them off to heaven and I would be left behind. You know, two in a bed, one taken, one left, all that kind of stuff. Well, I long ago dumped all of this nonsense. And along with it, I dumped the idea of the soul as the immortal thing that ended up in heaven or hell. But I never have dumped the notion of the soul or a belief in the reality which that word attempts to point to. And even more so, I came to believe in the idea of soulfulness. I like that even more, actually, which I absolutely believe points to some kind of reality that we all experience in some way or other in our lives. For me, soul is a way of referring to the central core of one's being. It's what puts being into human being, if you like. And I think soulfulness shows up in many, many different ways. I think of an occasion when we used to rent a really tumble-down cottage in the middle of a field in Yorkshire for nearly 30 years, actually. It was through 5 gates to get to, and there was no electricity, no services, certainly no things like internet or mobile signals. But it was a deeply kind of, well, I'd call it a thin place. You know, the Celts used to say that the distance between earth and heaven is about 3 feet, and there are thin places where it's even less. And it was that sort of place to me, somewhere where something stirred inside of you, and not always in the lovely sunny days of summer. We would go there all the year round. And I can remember being there often in the melancholic depth of autumn. I remember one particular time when Pat was cooking breakfast and I took the dog out to walk him up the valley. And as I came out, this mist descended over everything so that I could barely see anything at all. And I could hear a stream flowing. I could hear a couple of buzzards crying overhead. And in that strange, melancholic, misty place, I just felt this almost ecstatic sense of oneness with everything. The sense that I'm part of something bigger than me, I think, is an essential part of what the soul is about, what soulfulness is about. And I guess you've all had some experience a little bit like that. I mean, another huge one for me was listening to Leonard Cohen. Now, there's a soulful man, or was. And I remember being in a field listening to him, and it was pouring down with rain. And I like rain when you can look at it out of a window. And it was absolutely pissing down, you know? And I could actually feel it kind of running down, you know, in little streams down my neck and, you know, wetting my underpants and everything. But, you know, you don't need to know about that. But, and then he introduced the Webb sisters, were 2 English sisters who were part of his backing group on his tour not long before he died. And they sang his song, If It Be Your Will, which is a strange mixture of biblical imagery and all the strange things that Leonard Cohen could muster up. And as I say, it felt pretty horrible and wet and damp and pretty chilly. And yet standing there, listening to these sisters, one of them playing a handheld harp and the other a guitar, and singing this gorgeous, sumptuous song that Leonard Cohen says is more of a prayer. I just, again, had that sense of oneness with everything. And I didn't really care about everything being wet and sodden or anything. Now, as I say, we've probably all had such experiences. And a lot of what the soul is about, I think, in my experience, is about creating or giving the sense of one's connection with nature and with everything around you, with people beyond yourself. It's that which takes us beyond the ego self. I think soul is what tells us who and what we should be in the world. Not really selfish twats, if you forgive me saying so, you know, causing unnecessary pain and suffering to other people, not greedy grabbles, not silly prats passing judgment on others because they're different to us or they have a different take on the world, but rather being compassionate, seeking justice and equity in the world, pursuing goodness even when it hurts, caring for nature, appreciating beauty, feeling grateful even that we're alive. I think this is what being soulful means. It's that gritty life force that brings depth to our lives, that brings depth to art and music. Hasidic Jews call it the spark of the divine in every being. With beautiful ambiguity, Buddhists speak of a soul which is as big self and little self, or no self rather. For humanists, it's about identity and integrity. The Quakers, who I like a lot, call it the inner light of Christ, that of God in everyone. Call it what you will, it doesn't matter. I think we all know when it's not there, you know, when the world feels soulless, when situations that we're in and people's behavior is just soulless. And it's a word that I think we can't fully define and probably shouldn't ever try to, but we know what it is, I think. And we certainly know when it's not there. I think that addictions of many kinds, consumerism, instant gratification, the need to win, to project ourselves on the world and other people, etc., are soulless substitutes for spirituality, ways to bolster the ego instead of feeding the soul. Let me read you this from my book. It's the first contribution. It's called Blessed Are the Giver-shits. Blessed are the giver-shits, the ones who can't stand idly by while others suffer or the planet groans. Blessed are those who laugh at themselves. They will never run short of things to laugh at. Blessed are the buskers who lift our spirits when we're stressed and rushing to the tube. Blessed are those who don't get into social media squabbles, who starve daft people of attention. Blessed are those who spontaneously decide to pay forward at a coffee shop or make up the difference when a shopper hasn't got enough at the checkout. Blessed are the big issue vendors who stand or sit on the street in all weathers to make an honest quid or two. Blessed are the cheesemakers. They make a lot of crackers very happy. Blessed are those who know the difference between a mountain and a molehill. Blessed are those who stay human instead of playing God. Their life will be a whole lot easier. Blessed are the cracked, for they let the light in. So I gave this evening this wonderful enigmatic title, because I think that it's about playing around with notions and ideas and images of God. Let me just come to the fact that probably for centuries, religion and spirituality were basically one and the same, right? If someone was religious, you'd assume that they were spiritual. If they were spiritual, you would assume that they were religious. These two things were almost synonyms for one another. But then in recent times, a rift has come between the two, a divide that has separated them. and particularly has made a lot of people identify themselves as spiritual but not religious. There's been a widespread disillusionment with mainstream religion, and yet that hasn't in any sense meant that people are less spiritual than they ever were. Not at all. I think that spiritual aspirations and ambitions and hopes are still as prevalent in people's lives as they ever were, but maybe now not attached with or tied up with religious language. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was an amazing man. He was, you may have heard of him, he was a theologian and church leader in Germany during the war. And he, for better or worse, he took part in a plot to assassinate Hitler, which didn't pull off, as we know. And he was in prison. And in fact, he was executed in a German prison camp about a couple of weeks before the world ended, sadly. But some of his best work came out of his time in prison, and they're published in a book called Letters and Papers from Prison. And in it, he had some incredibly interesting and intriguing thoughts that he put out there, which sadly he never got the chance to elaborate upon. So lots of people have tried to do that ever since. But in one of his papers, he speaks about the fact that he could see in the world that he lived in the 40s, this is, a shift was taking place away from what he called religious consciousness towards something he named as a world come of age. So by religious consciousness, he was talking about a state of things, excuse me, that had long prevailed, really, in which God talk was assumed to be the norm, in which the church and church leaders had authority to dictate into people's lives about what they should or shouldn't believe, how they should or shouldn't behave, and so on and so forth. So there was a kind of ambience of a religious consciousness that was sort of just assumed. And I'm sure the process started way back before Bonhoeffer was even a twinkle in someone's eye, but he could recognize in the world that there was a shift away from, that this was crumbling and disappearing, that God talk no longer resonated with people. And instead there was a move toward what he called a world come of age. I don't think he meant by that a world that was all mature and grown up. I mean, clearly that's not true. But I think what he meant by it was a world which no longer needed the crutch, you might put it, or the support of all of that religious consciousness that had gone before. Science was now obviously the dominant means through which, or filter through which we look at the world. And all the other sort of insights that evolved over the previous couple of centuries had meant that religion, excuse me, and God talk and so on had really sort of disappeared and become redundant. And by, excuse me, a world come of age, therefore, he was talking about a world that was no longer dependent on religious explanations and authority, no longer needing God talk. But he felt that this did not mean that the true aspirations of religion, if you like, the spiritual core of religion, was disappearing or going away, but that it would need to find fresh expression. And so he spoke about it as a religionless Christianity. He said he could see that a new religious Christianity, religionless Christianity, was emerging, a faith or spiritual experience which is outside of the bubble of prescribed religion, a way of discovering God by whatever name or label in the very midst of life, instead of being shut away in a religious ghetto. And so spirituality is no longer tied to religion. And I think that this, way of looking at things that Bonhoeffer opened up and introduced has found expression in lots of different ways. I wrote a book a few years back, as you've heard, called How to Be a Bad Christian and a Better Human Being. I wasn't really writing about how to be a rotten Christian, that might be part of it, but I was writing about the fact that the people who experience love or appreciate beauty in art or nature, or who are fascinated by truth and meaning in life, or simply sense gratitude for being alive on this beautiful planet, actually experience something of God, whether they believe in God or not, however it's named. Because the problem with the word God is it's so laden, it's so loaded with assumptions and explanations that have been passed down. But whatever it is that that word at its best has tried to point towards, I think that there are hordes and hordes and hordes of people who connect to that, who may not subscribe to any religious creed or tradition, who don't belong to any religious club, who are just getting on with their lives. But I think it's because of this quality of soul that we all have embedded in our humanity, that there is that sense of connection and the need of connection with that which is beyond ourselves. And so the big problem really is this chap here, actually. I think that this kind of notion of God, obviously cartooned here, but this notion of God as being a being, probably a man, up there somewhere in the heavens or in another place outside of the world, who is doing all kinds of incredible, wonderful and magical things, and who occasionally sort of visits down here or brings influence down here. Meanwhile, the faithful are sending prayers up there and reaching out to that God and believing that God is in some way like a sort of, fat controller in the sky, if you like. Someone who's got a big mixing desk with lots of levers and buttons and can make things happen if we only pray in the right way, or if we join the right group, or if we have enough faith, or whatever it may be. And I think this model of God, which is basically classic theism, is probably the biggest reason for so many people turning away from the notion of God altogether in our day. I think that this is an image of God that no longer has any credibility attached to it all. Though it is strange how people, even people who have nothing to do with religion, in certain circumstances will fall back into this kind of model, who will pray to God desperately for some divine intervention, even though they don't necessarily believe in God. But that's saying something more about us and our situation in our need in the world than anything else. So I think that my own notion of God in those terms has long since gone. And I've been very influenced by a philosopher and theologian in the mid-20th century called Paul Tillich, who really sort of saw that religious language was no longer working, but he did believe that there was some kind of referent, that religious language did point towards something, but that the language used was no longer of any use at all. So he said, if when we think about God, we're thinking about something that may or may not exist, we're not thinking about God. He had something else in mind. He said, God doesn't exist. God is existence. God is not a being among other beings, not even the most superior of beings, but rather God is the ground of being. And these sort of ideas of Tillich are ones that have resonated a great deal with me and shifts us away from the sort of classic theistic pictures of God. If I could put it like this, just give you these three little models, really. Theism is basically, as I just pointed out, the idea of a God who's up there, out there, somewhere else. And the world is down here, and there is this belief that in some way God can intervene and do whatever God wishes, though strangely enough doesn't seem to do the things that really you'd think a God would do, some mysterious will that he holds on to. Pantheism is the belief that God and the world are one and the same, so everything is God and God is everything. And I have quite a lot of sympathy for pantheism. Atheism is obviously the notion that there is no God and there is just the world. And so these sort of three models, interestingly, which all use the word theism. So they're all clustered really around a particular paradigm. that has been set historically by the church and by other religious traditions with some sort of notion of a theistic God. There is another way of looking at this, which I find myself much more drawn to. In contrast to this, it's panentheism. So it sounds quite like pantheism, but it's got that little term "en" inserted, which is the Greek term for "in." So it's the idea that God is in everything and everything is in God. And so we've shifted away here from a big guy in the sky, from that sort of primitive notion of a God outside who influences and controls things, to a God who is completely immersed in the world, but is not necessarily one and the same with the world. So I think that probably one of the best definitions of this, and one of the best statements about God in the Bible, in the New Testament actually, is where Paul, he's at the Areopagus in Athens, on Mars Hill, where there are all sorts of altars to different gods there. And he sees this one altar, which is simply an altar to the unknown God. And he addresses this, and he says that, you know, that the God who these people who had this altar were worshipping ignorantly was what he wanted to talk about and proclaim to them. But it's interesting the way that he did it, because, you know, whenever Paul in the New Testament, when talking to Jewish audiences, which he did a lot, when he went into the synagogues, he invariably began talking from the Hebrew scriptures, what, you know, we know as the Old Testament. And he tried to persuade them that Jesus was the fulfillment of the Jewish hope and vision of the future. But interestingly, when he went to non-Jewish audiences, he never used the Bible at all. And in fact, this is an instance where he actually quoted a Greek poet. These are the words of a Greek poet who said, "In God we live and move and have our being." And I find that kind of a much more helpful way of thinking about God. I put it like this, really. If you think about this fish here, well, he lives, or I think it's a he, could be a she or he, lives in the sea, in the ocean or whatever. The ocean is in the fish and the fish is in the ocean. The fish has no notion about oceans or seas. In fact, this fish, I don't know this one personally, but for all I know, this fish could be an ocean denier, you know, could go about swimming around saying, I don't believe, you know, everyone's talking about the sea, everyone's talking, I don't believe in it at all. It really doesn't matter, because that's the reality in which this fish lives. So that's a kind of, you know, one way of thinking about the panentheistic view of God. I mean, another way of putting it, which I like a lot actually, is to think about that wonderful blue line there, which I always love seeing images of the planet from space, don't you? And you always see that incredible little blue line around, which is, you know, so easily overlooked, and yet that's everything. That's the atmosphere. Without the atmosphere, we would just wither and die. There would be no life on this planet at all. Everything hinges on the atmosphere. And you could say that in the atmosphere, we live and move and have our being, you know. Whether we believe in the atmosphere or not doesn't matter, because it's here, it's in us, we're in it. It's just part of the reality of everything around us. So rather than thinking about the notion of divine intervention, a panentheistic view of God thinks about divine interaction, that God is interacting with everything all of the time, rather than someone outside who occasionally sort of gets involved or not, as the case may be. So I think another way of thinking about this is, and this is something which Paul Tillich spoke about, he said, you know, there's a surface dimension to life, which is our ordinary everyday life. And we sort of get on with things. We have jobs, and we, you know, have families, and, you know, we buy cars, and we have money or not. And all of these things go on. And he was saying that really some people live their whole life. And in fact, lots of our daily life is just swirling around on that surface of life. But he said there is a depth dimension to life too. And it has heights and it has depths, you know. I can think of, you know, I've told you about a couple of my experiences, but if I went back even further, I think one of my ecstatic experiences where I sensed, looking back now, the depth dimension of God was when Pat had our first daughter, Jenny, and I held that little scrap of life in my arms. And the sheer ecstasy of it just so broke with everything. Actually, when I went out 6 hours later to find my car, I didn't know where I parked it. Somewhere in Liverpool, I parked it. I didn't know where I parked it. I wandered round and round and round, and eventually came to the correct conclusion that someone had stolen it. You know, that's what happened. And I remember borrowing 10 shillings from the telephonist in the hospital. Remember those things? And I was in the taxi going home, and I just had this thing swirling around in my head. My precious sky blue Mini, the joy of my life, has been stolen. It's gone, and I don't care, because I've got a little girl. I've got a little Jenny in my life, you know. And so the surface of ordinary everyday stuff was broken by realizing there's another dimension to life. I think it happens very often for us through the depths down here when we lose someone that we love. You know, death is a massive means of breaking the surface of life and suddenly plunging us into a depth dimension where all kinds of things are happening, where nothing is quite as clear anymore. And we're trying to make sense of things, trying to look for meaning in things. And having, you know, for the last 20 years before I retired, working in a parish in North London, in Islington, I think I took about 1,500 funerals, you know, and I've sat with a lot of people who are not religious for the most part, who were not churchgoers, but who had lost loved ones, and just watching this disorientation go on as they suddenly experienced the depth dimension of life. What Paul Tillich says is that it's in this depth dimension is actually, well, he used it as a synonym for God. He said God is the depth dimension to life, to reality. I think it's also about the soul too, that the soul is that part of us which connects with the depth dimension to life. And whether we do that through you know, music or the beauty of art, through love in our lives, through prayer or mindfulness or whatever, I think that it's when we sense life's multi-dimensionality. And so from that perspective, Paul Tillich made the interesting controversial point that he said, if God is the depth dimension to reality and life, then he said the only way that you could really be an atheist is if you believe that life has got no depth. If everything is just the superficial stuff on the surface. Well, you get the point that he's making, that that, you know, once we shift away from thinking of the guy up there, and we begin to open up to the possibility of what we point to and call God as being something much more mundane in a way, much more a part of our ordinary everyday existence, then it opens up a lot of other possibilities. And so I wrote this book on prayer, OMG, to really say that prayer is less a religious activity than it is a universal instinct. I think it's a kind of coverall term for how we sense or connect with or respond to what some of us may call the divine or the transcendent or ultimate or that which is greater than us in different ways, named in different ways or even not named at all. Prayer, I think, is something that's utterly democratic. No one owns prayer. No one has the right to define prayer finally or prescribe what it means or how it should be done. I think it just happens in people's lives. And I would say that there's prayerfulness, which in a way is kind of unintentional prayer that is part of our lives. And there's kind of intentional prayer. And I suppose religion has all been about the more intentional kind. But actually, I think it's not as straightforward as that. I know I personally find that there's a prayer in the New Zealand Anglican prayer book, which I like much more than the English one, by the way. And there's a prayer there, which is a night prayer, which has this little section that says, what is done is done. What is not done is not done. Let it be. And I love that. And in fact, as much as I can, that's how I go to sleep at night. I put my head on the pillow and think, the day is done. What is done is done. What is not done is not done. Let it be. It's a kind of prayerful sort of way of looking at the world, looking at one's life. And it doesn't necessitate that you believe in a specific being called God, because I think, as I've already said, that's just a word, I sometimes, actually, the other end of the spectrum, I sometimes try anyway, when I get up in the morning and go to make a cup of tea, because mostly I make it first thing in the morning, though I haven't been too well lately, as you can hear from my coffee. Pat's sort of been doing a lot of it of late, in fairness. But very often when I get up and make a cup of tea, and I'll come back and bring a cup of tea in and open the curtain and just lean on the windowsill and just look out. And I love blue skies. I love sunshine. But life's not always like that, is it? And so sometimes I look out, as we have of late, and look at grayness and, darkness. But I just like to take a moment to welcome whatever this day is bringing to me, and to be open for whatever this day brings. That's a kind of, not a particularly religious, but a sort of intentional way of praying. But, there's a man where in North London, well, this woman was dying, and her husband, who, they weren't church people, but he got in touch and asked if I would go and say a prayer with his wife, because she was very near the end. And so I went along, and I've long ago learned that, silence is much better than a load of words in the really difficult issues of life. I once thought that I had to be a walking encyclopedia to try and explain everything to people, and that didn't work out too well. But I've realized that it's presence that matters, and so I sat there and just was there with this couple, and he asked if I could go out the room with him for a moment, and I don't think she was conscious, but he somehow wanted to talk to me on his own, and he said, I really want to pray for her, Dave, but I don't know what to say, and I don't even think I believe in God, which is a kind of interesting paradoxical statement, but it's saying this, that prayer somehow is some deeper instinct than beliefs that you tick off or creeds that you subscribe to or whatever. There's something more embedded. And so I said, honestly, you don't need any words at all, or just spit it out. Just say what you want to say. I don't think it matters whether you believe in God. This is what you want to do and what you're feeling. And actually, I think the fact that you want to pray is sort of a prayer already. And so we went back in, and he took his wife's hands, and he just sat there in silence. And he said, she's a good wife, and I'm really going to miss her. And the sheer minimalism of that prayer totally cracked me up, But there was something going on which this is not about religious, not about words, it's not about all that kind of crap, It's about something in our beings. This is, to me, where we're in the realm of soul, really. And I think it's completely sort of democratic. And I know that in times of sheer desperation, there are times when I do shout out and scream out to God in my Sunday school form, asking God to intervene and do something about this. All my beliefs tell me something different, but, there's that kind of gut level thing where these things go on. So let me finish with another prayer, from the book, which is called, What is Your Real Name, God? Are you really bothered about being omni this or omni that, God? I doubt it. You're surely far too busy checking on the turtle doves and tree sparrows, the nightingales which have flagged by 90% since England won the World Cup. Your name isn't really God. That's just a tag we gave you long before the Bible was a thing. Your name is the sound of a baby breathing, the last gasp of Sandra, who departed life too soon, but managed to meet Ray, her only grandchild, before leaving. You are the rustling in the cherry trees, the wind whistling around the eaves when we lie in bed feeling mortal. You're the twinkle in the eye of the beggar who always says thank you even when no one puts anything in the hat. You're the freedom we sense on top of a hill looking over the fields, the bulb lighting up in our brains when a good idea dawns, the satisfaction of a job well done. I don't care how many omnis you have to your name, how many creeds to celebrate your almightiness. I prefer to know you, God of small things, in the seeming insignificant bits of life, where I think you often hide, holding the world in your everlasting arms. So I hope that gives a little insight into how I, with a history deeply rooted in a rather rigid Christian tradition, have emerged out of that, not to abandon my belief in something called God or soul or prayer, but to find a completely fresh way to understand and think about these things. And I think that, you know, they now tell us that there's something called spiritual intelligence. You know, we used to think that intelligence was all about rational thinking measured by something called IQ. And then in the 1980s, the whole thing was blown apart and other things. And we've got emotional intelligence and physical intelligence. But now people talk about a spiritual intelligence. And I think that's kind of coming somewhere near to soul. And I think it is that capacity to process the whys of life rather than just the whats. And I don't think that this is tied automatically to religion. I think there are lots of religious people, not to put too fine a point on it, who are probably spiritually quite dumb. I've lived in this world for a long time. I think there are people who are atheists and people who are completely non-religious who I think have enormous spiritual intelligence. And maybe that's another helpful way to think about this and to, you know, cultivate the sense of soul in our lives and in our world. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you so much, Dave. That was wonderful. Really nice to listen to you. I want to take the opportunity to just ask you a couple of questions, and then we will send, I think, Robin round with the microphone to take questions and comments from the audience. So do please keep them fairly brief, but we do have plenty of time. So I think just before we go to the audience, I think one thing I wanted to ask, and I was reminded a bit about one of our previous speakers, Eric Olson, who was talking about the soul. He talked for a long time about the brain and changes in the brain and how they can affect consciousness and why that means the soul couldn't be a separate thing and so forth. And at the end, someone said, you've talked about the mind for the whole time, haven't you? Why haven't you used the word mind at all in the last 45 minutes? So I think it's a very confusing and misleading word, and we probably shouldn't ever talk about minds. When you were talking about God, you seemed to talk a lot about how it was a misleading picture, or it conjured a misleading picture. Why is it useful to keep using the word if you think it is?
Using the word God?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, that guy, Paul Tillich, I mentioned, and actually other people, similarly, I know that he said it would be a great thing if we could have a moratorium on the word God for at least 100 years.
Okay.
And I think that's a great idea. I agree with that because, as I say, it is such, you know, an abused and loaded term. I think in reality, that's not something that is likely to happen very easily anyway. So I guess that I live within a certain language game, as Wittgenstein might have called it, you know, in which there is a grammar and there's, you know, and sometimes, just like our English language, talking to some people can be deeply confusing and not necessarily helpful for communication. Similarly, I find that's true in the kind of realm of religion, but somehow I feel it is the kind of, it's the ground that we have to work with, you know. So I suppose really, because an awful lot of my time is spent in the church, speaking to people often whose faith has kind of untangled and fallen to pieces. That those are my kind of prime audience, really. And I suppose, you know, my direction is trying to help people to rework God talk in a way that can be more helpful and useful. I appreciate that it would be really nice and easy if you could just scrap it all and start again, but I don't know that that's realistic.
And one last question from me before we open it up. You, I think, started off in your framing sounding quite optimistic about, you know, a large, perhaps even a growing number of people developing some spiritual awareness and intelligence. But you briefly touched on things like social media squabbling.
Yes, squabbling.
Not to mention squalloping.
Yeah, that as well.
And you didn't even touch on politics. You know, you're always wise, but you know, people might observe that politics around the world, geopolitics, national politics doesn't seem to be getting more spiritual and more unifying. I'd probably say that with some confidence. So how optimistic are you that we're trending towards greater spiritual awareness?
That's terribly hard. But I think that the problem is we do live in such a media-dominated and laden world, and not just the mainstream media now, but social media, which is another whole murky sort of level to it. And I'm involved with it a lot, by the way. I'm not sort of you know, knock it all, but I think that we have this information and a sense of things coming to us from lots of different directions, which can give us, I think, a really very depressing outlook on the world. My experience of people is not like that. And I think that, you know, my connections with people close at hand and far away suggest that there are lots and lots and lots of people who long for something different to all of that, who are looking for something more, and who do have this basic sort of inner sense of how things are supposed to be. Now, you know, the election in America works very much against what I'm saying right now, because I don't know how people could vote for Donald Trump. I mean, I just don't know how they did that, really. So there it is. I've said politics now. But I think that I do think that there are many. I would dare to think that most people, you know, have a sense of a vision and a longing for the world to be a place of goodness and kindness, and of love, really. But I think that we're so burdened with all this other sort of information, all these other images and symbols that, and that's why I often tell people, you know, limit the amount you take, because, you know, I think we need to protect ourselves from an overload of devastatingly bad news, with no counterbalancing good news to go with it. And so I think we have to kind of protect ourselves to some extent against that tsunami of depressive information, and not just information, but a whole spirit, a sort of sense and emotion that, you know, could make me just not want to get up in the morning if I take on board too much of that. So I think that, you know, we need to also foster community in which we, you know, nurture goodness and kindness and hopefulness amongst ourselves. I often define hope as defiant imagination, even in the face of despair, right? So I think that fear and depression and anxiety are all functions of the imagination, basically, aren't they? You know, our imagination is fed down a direction and can go wild, thinking of all the bad things that can happen and might happen. I think that hope is something which isn't just like a limp, you know, optimism. It's not optimism. Oh, it'll all turn out in the end. No, no. It's got this quality of gritty defiance about it that says, I refuse to think that the way things are and the way I'm being told things are is how it has to be. And okay, I can't change the geopolitical situation, but I can do something about the world that I'm a part of, you know, here and now. And I think that, you know, feeding that in your own locality of relationships and networks, as it were, is one way to increase a more hopeful outlook on life.
Yes, Dave. Some support for that from the audience. Good to hear. I think we had a couple of questions. Yes, we've got one there, just in front of you, Robin, and then afterwards, gentleman in the purplish jumper behind.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I was a bit disappointed that there was actually nothing I could really disagree with.
Try harder.
I did have a question I wanted to ask you. I was looking at one of your books this afternoon, and you drew a distinction between faith and belief, which seems to me a very seminal difference. And I wondered whether you could say anything more about that. And in addition to that, whether you could say whether you felt that ritual has a part there. That was all.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I think that, you know, the original roots of the word faith have much more to do with trust than to do with belief. In other words, it's got a more personal dimension to it. And I think that so if you go back, what I see to be the kind of root of a Christian approach to faith is that it is about trusting, especially for Christians, in a person, in the figure of Jesus, and seeing that this is someone who embodies and represents so much of what we love and would wish to see propagated more in the world. There's a personal kind of nature to that. I think as time went on, faith turned into beliefs, so that, you know, you're one of the faithful if you subscribe to certain beliefs. And we've got, you know, there are all these councils and creeds and everything else that were produced. And the thing about you know, the creeds is that they were forged out of debates and arguments, questions that were being asked at the time. Why those have to then become for all time the things that people are supposed to believe, I can't for the life of me begin to understand, because we're asking different questions now. We're in a different context, and therefore the whole thing has switched and changed. I'm not really bothered about arguments, arcane arguments about the Trinity or about, you know, the Virgin, but, you know, all these things which to me as a modern person living now in this world just seem improbable and unhelpful. I think that we need to sort of be debating things which are here and now, but definitely I think that faith for me isn't primarily something up here in the head. I think faith is primarily something down here in the gut. And I think that is a seminal difference. So I think that, you can have that sense down here in your gut, which is all that I've been talking about this evening, really. You can have all that down there without having any of the edifice of beliefs up here, which we've been told us sort of the essentials of what Christianity is all about. So I think it's more, I think it's the faith is more about, it's more of a personal thing, and it's more about trust and hopeful imagination, actually, than it is about whether I can sort of tick these boxes and recite this creed every week, which mostly for me sounds like gobbledygook.
Was that the comment on ritual at the end there?
Oh,
Or did you want to add
add
to that?
Yeah. Well, I think that ritual at its best is not at all about belief. You know, I think it's about enactment. So for me, you know, I could talk about specifics, but you know, if I talked about something like the Eucharist, which I'd need another whole evening to talk about, really, but I think that I can be part of a ritual like that without necessarily affirming or contributing to any of the kind of beliefs that have all attached themselves to that, because there's something more kind of primal about the ritual. Is really very primal, I think, and I think that it is the stuff of the soul rather than the stuff of the intellect, and that's part of what I get from church. And maybe at times, you know, things are being recited which, if I sit down and think about them, do sound like gobbledygook. But actually, that's not really what bothers me. It's the enactment of ritual, I think, which is still a very powerful force in the world and human experience. But I think we need to renew it, you know, not just sort of repeat the same old rituals, but to be ritual makers. And I look around today and think, you know, are we developing the best rituals that we could have in our world? I think we're developing lots of rituals, but they're not necessarily wholesome. They're not necessarily feeding the soul. And I think that's something that is an area of concern for me.
We had a question a little further back. Yeah. And then we'll come to the front after.
Thank you so much for that. And again, those words resonated enormously. I suddenly rather wondered, was it really so easy to understand one of the big complicated issues of our existence? And then I thought, well, people's spiritual experiences are very subjective, and different people feel different spiritual experiences. So then I thought, well, isn't that therefore, and if God is in spiritual experiences, well, by whatever name, whatever concept that is, isn't that encouraging meism? My God, my truth, and somebody mentioned the word unification, the unifying thing. And so how is unification, how is the feeling of what is good and what is not good, what is good for humanity, what's not good for humanity, encouraged by philosophy, which is basically saying God, by whatever that means, is all about what you personally experience. How does it take things further? How does it bring the world together? The head of the Russian Orthodox Church is feeling a sense of spirituality, which is probably very different from mine at the moment. Who's to say whether his is better or mine is better on that basis? So in a way, it's kind of copping out. You could say it's copping out because it doesn't take things further. There's no unifying set of mores to which we can all look to give us guidance. But
yeah, no, that's good. I mean, I think that what unifies us is something more than a set of beliefs that we subscribe to. You know, I think that's one way of looking at it, but I think that very easily produces what I think is false community, which is conformity. So I think the conformity is often mistaken for unity, and it's bad. It's a bad form of unity, uniformity. But I think, you know, we need to grow up. I think as a world, you know, and there's all sorts of levels of life. and understand that real community can exist, a bond can exist between people, even though they have quite diverse opinions and ideas. So I think, I mean, I wrote a book called Black Sheep and Prodigals. I see myself as both, really. But I was really trying to propagate what I call black sheep spirituality, which was stop just conforming and going along. Trust yourself, trust your mind. And if you want to put it in God language, trust the God who is in you, rather than the God that is being imposed from the outside. But the challenging question that raises is that black sheep, is an idea that we normally think of as being out there all on your own, the individual thing that you're talking about. And I suppose the thing I was putting forward in that book is asking, can we have communities? Can we have herds of black sheep? Can we have community that doesn't require uniformity, that can live with diversity, without just sinking into war and conflict and haranguing each other? Let's have argument. I love argument. Let's argue till the cows come home. I think argument and debate and that's all rich and wonderful. We need that. And I think actually the thing is that tradition, has so often been reduced to the idea of something which is, a bit like an object, like this is our tradition. And being faithful to that tradition means passing it on to the next generation, and they take it exactly as it is and keep it as is and pass it on and pass it on. I mean, that's what Creed's saying and all that kind of stuff is doing. But I think tradition can be seen from a quite different point of view. I think that tradition should be seen much more as a vibrant conversation, debate, even argument. And in practice, that's what tradition tends to be. It's about sort of holding together with each other in the midst of tensions and diversities and disagreements. And yeah, of course, there will be specific things in which we need to agree so that we can act some outcomes, of course. And so compromise comes into it, yes. But I think, unity rather than uniformity is what the world needs. It's certainly what I think the church needs. And that's what I think we can, but it's really about being grown up. I think, too often now we're still behaving like children in the worst sense at times. I think, arguing and fighting and battling and everything. I mean, you look at things, as you've already heard, I'm a chaplain to a thing called St. Ethelburga Centre for Reconciliation and Peace in the City of London, which is a centre who's based in a church building, which was completely redundant, but blown up by the IRA in the early 1990s. And the Bishop of London, bless his heart, stood in the ruins of a 12th century church. And rather than going down the ridiculous road of trying to rebuild this church as part of our heritage, when it wasn't even a living community anyway, instead he said, this thing should be rebuilt to be a centre for reconciliation and peace. And I love that. And I think that the heart and soul of it is saying, let's create a space where we can disagree all we like. We can argue and have barneys about everything. That's all good, but can we just respect each other as human beings, find our common humanity, and out of that forge through, yes, the edgy conversations we need to have, something that can take us forward in a more hopeful and helpful direction.
Thank you, Dave. We had one question at the front next, Robin. Oh, have you got one there as well? We'll come there next. So we'll go to the front and then, who was it with the next question? We'll find out. Go for it.
Yeah. I wondered whether you believe that there would be less violence in the world if more people believed the God that you believe in.
I absolutely believe that, yes. I think that the problem is that, from a Christian point of view, and indeed Judeo-Christianity, we are peoples of a book, right? We've got a book, the Bible, which has got, what Christians lovingly call the Old Testament, which is really the Hebrew Bible, and the Christian scriptures. And when you dig back into this, you know, clearly, I think there is an evolving notion of God within, you know, there's a trajectory within those texts. But, you know, the roots back there, which constantly come back, is a picture of a warrior God, you know, a God who sort of, you know, tribalistically sides with this body of people here and says, you know, I'm giving you this land, you go in there and kick them all out and kill them and they're beasts. I mean, if you look at the texts in the Bible, they're awful. You know, there are some pretty horrible texts but the point is, I don't think that is, to me, I'm not a literalist. I don't think that is saying that's what God's like. God said this. I think that's what people's understanding and interpretation of God was. But I think the way that we picture God massively influences the way we live as human beings and as communities. So if our God is this kind of warrior God, then it's understandable that that's transferred down into our consciousness and experience, and we become conflictual people with some notion of truth, you know, which is our truth that has to be accepted by everybody else or else. You know, I mean, and when you put that into the kind of cosmic proportions that traditional Christianity has done, you know, saying you're either part of us or you're going to suffer, mate, for the whole of eternity, conscious suffering in hell. You know, what the heck is that about? What sort of God are we talking about here? So, yes, I think that
your answer is yes.
Yes, we need to find different, you know, different knowledge and understanding of
different interpretation.
Different interpretation,
yes. What has been written and people have
absolutely
misinterpreted over the years.
Exactly. And as already been pointed out, you know, hermeneutics is my kind of field of interest. So I think it's all about interpretation. Nothing comes to us uninterpreted. You know, we always interpret, and I think everything hinges on the kind of interpretations that we have. And I think, you know, one of the great gurus of the world of hermeneutics was the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur. And, you know, thinking about the people who along their faith unravels because they, you know, the Dietrich Bonhoeffer thing, you know, they can't believe that anymore. It all begins to entangle. And Paul Ricoeur says, beyond the desert of criticism, we wish to be called again. That's the positive thing. Many people, they go into the desert of criticism. The whole thing untangles and falls apart and it doesn't make any sense. And that's where the journey ends. Whereas I think that it's possible to be called again, to find a different sort of interpretation of very fundamental basic things that we have, but which have got locked up in metaphors and symbols and models of the past.
Thank you. We had a question at the back. Was there one you saw as well earlier, Robin? No? To the back then, please.
It's really interesting, and I found it difficult to disagree with anything you said. But I would say, would you still call yourself a Christian? And if you do, isn't one of the things that Christ said, I am the way, the truth, and the life? And that if people see humanity as made in the image of God, then truly did do that, and people would kill him. But some of what you say doesn't seem to fit with the sort of central Christian tenet that the only way to salvation is through Christ. You don't actually mention Christ in your
no, and the truth is, I'm a real Jesus freak. You know, I think that there is a difference between the Jesus that, as best we can, and we, you know, it's limited, the best we can get to something about what the historical Jesus was about, is vastly different to the Christ of the church in the stained glass windows and the creeds and so on. You know, and the shepherd God that you find in Jesus has been transformed again into this sort of world domination God, you know, the Pantocrator, you know, the great controller and so on. So, yeah, I think that the word Christian for me is horribly, horribly problematic. And I think that, I mean, what I've said in, you know, my How to Be a Bad Christian book is really all about me saying, what happens if we treat the word Christian as a verb instead of a noun? if it's a way of life instead of a way of being, rather than a label I wear and a club I belong to. See, I don't think there's the slightest shred of evidence from the Gospels anyway that Jesus ever intended to start a new religion. I don't think that was ever on his mind. I think that he was a Jew from the moment he was born to the day he died. His mission was to his own people. Well, he lived in that world, didn't he? But all the time that he interacted with people who were not Jews, overwhelmingly, he demonstrated an understanding that God was bigger than the Jewish people, you know? And so I think that, I mean, I look at, you know, the passage, the text you quoted, you know, saying I'm the way, the truth, and the life, that I don't think that he didn't say, and this is an interesting thing, if you look at the context of that passage in John 14, it was an answer to a question that he gave, right? But the question wasn't, what about Muslims? What about atheists? What about, you know, and him saying, no, you've got to follow me. It was actually an answer to a question of deep insecurity from Thomas, who was sensing something awful was coming about, and they were looking for, and so I think that when Jesus said, I'm the way, he didn't say that any particular doctrine was the way, any religion was the way. He said it was him, i.e., his way, which I think is manifested in lots of other people through the world, not just in him.
Well, isn't the next bit the only way to your father is through me?
Yeah.
Your father would be God,
It is.
So,
and I'd really love to help him reword that. But of course, from a kind of biblical critical point of view, I mean, this John's Gospel was written, you know, 80, 100, 60, 70, 80 years after Jesus was on this earth. And it is the most kind of theologically laden of the Gospels. You know, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, called the Synoptic Gospels, are the most kind of mundane, if you like, the most sort of earthy, whereas John's Gospel is very theologically laden and very mystical. And, you know, I mean, from the point of view of biblical scholarship, you know, most self-respecting Jesus scholars would say that these are not words that he ever uttered anyway in the first place. But even taking them as they are, as words in the Bible, I think that I interpreted as saying that, and one of my neighbours when I was a vicar in North London, who lived on the same road, I was out sort of on the street chatting with her one day, and she said, I don't think you're a Christian at all, Dave. So she didn't come to church. I thought, oh, that's good. She said, no, she said, I think you're a Jesus follower. And I could have kissed her, you know, because that is true. I see myself, not that I'm saying that Jesus is, I'm not saying that this is the only way to God. I think there are many ways to God. But I think that, you know, Jesus is the way that I know. It's my way. And it's how I know God and how I understand God. And for me, therefore, Jesus is, you know, definitive and profoundly important. But I don't think that necessarily has to be linked up to, you know, the notions of a miraculous birth and all that kind of stuff that goes with it, you know.
Who's got another question? We have one over on the ahead of you, Robin. Do you have any others? Over to you.
Thank you. Like everyone else, much to be inspired by tonight. So thank you very much indeed for that.
Thank you.
My question is, you said that we need to start by respecting everybody as human beings. And I wondered if there's a slight contradiction between that and your attitude to Republican voters.
I think it's a very good question, by the way, and I think it sticks a pin on a real struggle that I have, because I'm not saying I'm the perfect example of everything that I've said tonight, you know. So yeah, it's a struggle, but I think that what I've been saying loud and clear, you know, through my Holy Shed podcast things and wherever I go talk to people, talks I've given, is say, do not demonize people who voted for Donald Trump. You know, because I think we have to listen to people to understand what's going on. Now, actually, I think in the big picture, the fact that 82% of white evangelical Christians voted for Donald Trump, both in 2016 and now, is a really interesting, problematic issue. And I think there are all kinds of issues to do with a notion of Christianity that I want to absolutely disagree with and argue with hugely. And I think that I fear partly the future. I fear Donald Trump less than I do a certain body of influential, charismatic Christian leaders who are very influential behind him, and who have got a very sort of black and white God and the devil, evil and everything. I mean, I think that what they are stirring up in him, I've got all kinds of problems with. But I think, you know, a friend of mine who's from California, I was talking with her just since the election, and I said, was it a shock to you? She lives here now. She said, no, it wasn't a shock at all to me or my husband. She said, you know, all of my family and most of my friends back in the States, who are almost all Christians, voted for Trump. And she said, you know, there's a lot of things going on there. You know, there are all kinds of concerns, which I think is the same as certain political tensions we have in this country. You know, I mean, I was absolutely, definitely a Remainer when it came to Brexit, you know. But I know families, friends of mine, whose families were utterly torn apart by this, and who couldn't hear the concerns that the others had, you know. And my friend in from California, she said, within my family and circle of friends, there are serious thoughts going on now about whether they can actually spend Christmas with each other, you know. So it becomes all that is, and it's this inability to listen to each other and to hold on to the fact that people see things differently to me. I want to go out and argue with all those people who voted for Donald Trump, and I would do it, you know, from day to morning till night. And there are lots of other things I would go and do that in, but I would like to do it in the context of respecting the humanity of people and working from an assumption that they've got a reason for doing what they're doing. And rather than just hurling sort of, you know, metaphorical rocks at each other, we need to be able to have proper debate. And I think when I think that something's happening in the world that I strongly disagree with and have big problems with, I think first and foremost, I think we have to have better arguments. You know, we have to bring better arguments to the table here, rather than just kind of demonizing people and saying they're uneducated, they're ignorant, and all those things that happened over Brexit here. You know, that's how I see it. So I think it's a tension, and I'm not saying I'm great at it. Sometimes I get really pissed off with people, you know, but then the better part of me, the soulish part of me, sort of comes in and says, you know, you've really got to listen to these people. And if you don't connect with their humanity, how are you going to expect them to connect with yours?
I think one of I talk with and work with a lot of Americans as well. And I think one of the challenging aspects of it is, and perhaps why it's challenging for you as well as the rest of us, is that, you know, in some way your vote is an expression of your deepest values. And if you're voting for someone who is encouraging fear, division, hatred of the other, selfishness, isolation, what does that say?
Yeah.
What does that say about you? And if you're, you know, as I understood it, your entire try not to say belief system, but value system is really about connection and unification and depth and what we have in common. I can see why it might be a bit difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, in all honesty, I think Donald Trump, as far as I know him, which is from quite a distance, he seems to me like an appalling person. And, you know, I really do dislike so much about him, but I would love to have a conversation with him. I'd love to try and understand some of what's going on in him. I'd love for us to have that kind of world where we are better able to listen, you know, and not to become all kind of pink and fluffy about it, because the world isn't like that. The issues are too difficult to be pink and fluffy. We've got to have hard conversations and arguments. But, you know, if we don't, what's the alternative? What is the alternative if we don't do that? And I'm very sad, really, that so often, you know, religion has been a bad element in all of this conversation. You know, that too often religion is, and I think arguments that, or conflicts and wars that sort of seem to revolve around religion, you know, I definitely want to say it's not really all about religion. There are a lot of other things here, but religion's part of it. And I think that, you know, I mean, the way I see this, if I just say this, the way I understand religions is that I see religions as being like different linguistic systems, okay? So they're like different languages, and they each have their own kind of cohesiveness, their own grammar, their own vocabulary, and there are things that make them hang together, right? Now, I can look at one and say, I like that one more than I like that one. But the thing is, they all have their own sort of characteristic about them. And the important thing isn't about the languages and the differences, but about what are we really trying to express through these languages. Now, I think that's actually should be a really universalistic thing about love and justice and commonality and so on, and cooperation and so on. But sadly, sometimes that's not what comes through. And yeah, I can understand why some people think the world would be a lot better off without them. I sometimes think that.
I think we have reached the point in the evening where Robin is allowed to ask a question. Robin, we only have a few minutes left, so over to you.
I love the concept of the anti-creed trajectory, this sort of anti-ritualistic trajectory. Do you find that certain other religions are more receptive to the message than others?
Yes, I think that, you know, the Abrahamic religions, right, of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, are all known as peoples of the book. Our books vary slightly, though there's a lot of overlap between them. But we're all kind of tied back to words, right? And that tends to produce kind of beliefs. Christianity, I think, is possibly the worst in terms of the way in which beliefs become everything. So you know, I think that, for instance, you know, within Judaism, there is a wonderful long tradition of constructive argument within Judaism, right? Sort of, you know, it's you know, 2 Jews, 3 opinions kind of thing. You know, there's this recognition. So yes, they are very textually oriented from a rabbinical point of view, but then they argue with the text, they play with the text. There's a tradition of it's called midrash, is the sort of the particular practice of interpretation that exists within Judaism, which is one that sort of plays around with the text and doesn't necessarily automatically accept the voice of the narrator as the final one, you know. But so I like that, and I think that Christianity could really learn a huge amount from that, because Christianity is much more creedally based, whereas you don't have creeds in Judaism, or in quite the same way within Islam. But I think that Sufism, that's true, which is much more. That's right, absolutely. But I think that some faith traditions, Buddhism and Hinduism and so on, are much less kind of word oriented and belief oriented. And so I think some are more kind of interesting. But I think that there are people. I do really believe this. There are people in all traditions and none who recognize that everything is a matter of interpretation, and that means we have to have conversations and arguments and all the rest of it, but to find constructive ways forward. So for 5 years, I travelled to Uxbridge, yes, and went to sit based in a school there. I sat on a panel with several people of different faith, you know, an imam and a Jewish rabbi and this, and month after month after month, we would sit there together with an audience of people of different traditions and kids from the school, by the way, and have damn good arguments about things. And there was banter, and there was kind of piss taking in a kind of way that was going on and everything. But you know, we all had a cup of tea afterwards, and there was this sort of sense of mutual respect amongst us, you know. And I think that model is just something that's needed so much more of. We didn't go away having changed each other's minds necessarily, but we did accept the fact that there was integrity in our differences. And that's kind of another thing that I think that, you know, we need more of, the acceptance of the integrity of the other. I'll just tell you one last story, which was, I'm a trustee of a thing called Greenbelt Festival. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's a big sort of Christian arts festival that happens every bank holiday Monday, and it's gone on for a long time, and it's evolved from being a kind of an evangelistic event to now being very, very open and liberal. We had Richard Dawkins there recently as a speaker, so you know, not many Christian events have Richard Dawkins there. And I remember some years back being at one talk which was being given by Bruce Kent. Do you remember Bruce Kent? Yeah. Chair of CND and stuff, and a Catholic priest, and an incredibly good man, actually. I love his spirit, you know. And he was giving this talk in this very articulate way that he did, with about 700 mainly young people all around. And then there was this one young man who had his hand up to ask a question. And he came in, and obviously Bruce Kent had been doing his thing about arms and disarms and all that kind of thing, you know. And this young American lad put his hand up and he said, what you people don't understand about us Americans, you know, is that we are looking after the world, you know. We have all these weapons because we're protecting the world, and without us and you see, and people all across his audience were all booing and hissing and calling out and everything. And Bruce Kent completely shut them all up. He just, you know, put them in the place, said, be quiet, speak, you know. And I thought, oh my goodness, I feel I'm watching Jesus here. You know, I think this would be what my picture of Jesus, you know, that he shut them all up and said, let this man speak. And he said, look, I can see that you, well, he said it a bit more, and he said, look, I'm glad you said what you said, because you clearly really wanted to, and you no doubt expressed the view of lots of people. He said, I think that your self-image of yourself as Americans is appallingly wrong. And he just came in with just one after the beautiful kind of slicing through it all, but he did it with such grace and such respect, you know, that he, as we used to say, played the ball and not the man. And I think that's part of what we're talking about, really. So I went away from that thing remembering nothing of what Bruce Kent said, but completely forever remembering who he was and how he was in that difficult context. And I thought, that's something I want to be like that when I grow up. I want to be like that man. I'm still growing up now.
We'll all get there hopefully at some stage. Thank you so much, Dave. That was a wonderful talk, and thank you for answering the question. We are going to take a break in December for another important spiritual event, which is Panto season coming up. So please do book on. That's going to be good fun, but that takes priority over philosophy in December. We will be back though in January. I forget the date actually. I haven't got it, but it's very easy. You just find the last Sunday in the month, and it's the Tuesday before that. That's how you do it. And we're going to be hearing from Daisy Dixon on immoral art. 21st, exactly. Thank you. 21st of January. She is a philosopher of art and an artist. Lectures at Cardiff, and she's going to be talking about different ways of thinking about the morality, or increasingly often the immorality of artists, reflects the interpretation and enjoyment we place on their and in their work. And she's going to talk about some difficult cases ranging from Hitler's landscapes to Rolf Harris's portraits. So if you're a fan of either of those, you'll be most welcome. Also, if you're interested in talking about the relevance of the artist's morality to their art. So that should be very interesting. 21st of January, I am assured. And you can book on as ever. Well, actually, we'll be getting it live on the website in a couple of weeks. So we'll send out an email to everyone and you'll be able to book on through the website. So thank you, all of you, for coming. We really appreciate it. Thank you, Robin and Andrew, for getting everything to work. Not as easy as we make it look. We don't make it look that easy, do we? But thank you for that. And a huge thank you to Dave and Pat for coming along. Thank you. And if you want a bit more, Dave, do come and talk to Pat and Dave at the front. Thanks, everyone.